Lately, I've been revisiting some of my old favorites that I remember particularly for being good looking, and have had a surreal experience realizing how many of them are actually just kinda bad. Sometimes I'll stumble across a movie which was even more of a masterpiece than I first realized, but other times I'll revisit something I'd considered a must-watch and realize that I don't even like it anymore. This is one of the latter cases, but it's fascinating to think that there was a time when I considered this to be a very cool and great-looking movie. It just goes to show how much a person's perspective can change as they learn more about the medium and develop more specific tastes. Sword of the Stranger is the most skip-to-the-end-ass movie I've ever seen. Really, it's 3 movies. The first is a 70-minute insufferable and convoluted mess about a boy and his dog running from some Chinese cult which employs superpowered hitmen and wants to sacrifice him in an immortality ritual, and then also there's this nameless swordsman with a dark past who protects the boy and bonds with him as they travel. Everything about this story is stupid and boring and doesn't go anywhere. Then the last 30 minutes of the film is a separate action horror movie, full of badass gore-splattered fight choreography and weird satanic yet Chinese sacrificial imagery, which is tonally confused at times because the boy and his dog traveling with parental drifter plot is still happening on top of it. And then, buried at the very back of that movie is a 3-minute short film of the most spectacular action scene ever put to animation, which doesn't feel like it's a part of the surrounding movie because it's such a technical marvel that nothing else compares to it. For the first 70 minutes, the film is visually as 6 out of 10 as it can get. For starters, the entire thing has a dull, unappealing color palette. I think they were trying to make it old and kinda worn looking like a classic samurai flick, but it's just so lifeless and unstylized. The character designs are questionable at best. Our wanderer protagonist is wearing a pretty unique outfit, but it looks like shit and isn't distinctive at all. It's not like you can't have a ragamuffin ex-samurai and make him iconic. The guy from Blade of the Immortal had a fucking swastika on his back, and you never forgot that. All the guys from Samurai Champloo are maybe a little cartoony, but ultra distinctive. All that sets the rival apart is blonde hair, blue eyes, and Chinese armor, and he's the biggest visual pulse in the film. Most of the character artwork is loose and lacking in detail. The line work is ultra thin, and the low detail on characters farther from the camera looks terrible. When they aren't fighting, they just kinda stand around while their lips flap like a TV anime. There's lots of obvious CG that didn't need to be there. Like, the water effects are abysmal, but they keep popping up. Hey, here's a shot where that's all that's on screen. Likewise, the background art is on a totally inconsistent sliding scale of impressionism. Sometimes there's photorealistic detail, and sometimes there isn't. Why even set so many shots against cobblestone if the cobblestone was gonna look like a bunch of scribbles? Where this gets weird is when the very simplistically shaded character art is moving through those impressionistic backgrounds and doesn't match with them stylistically in the slightest. All of the film's visual tropes are as generic as humanly imaginable. There's an evil lord in one of those rooms that evil lords are always in, and it looks like a stock asset of that idea. Same goes for the monk characters, or the random shacks and old people. Nothing's had more thought put into it than just recreating these standard anime backdrops. Entire scenes are not much better thought out. In one cheesy bit, the drifter makes a dramatic show of cutting the religious robes off of a monk, and it just comes off really stock and thematically weak, since this guy wasn't even really a character until now. Around halfway in, there's a tension build clearly meant to indicate a coming action scene, and then it cuts away to something totally unrelated before showing the aftermath of the fight in brief. Considering how ungodly slow the middle part of the film is, a fight here would probably have been perfect, and instead the blue balls are painful. So many long exposition scenes I spent fixated on the garbage use of digital lighting gradients. Basically, there's this one generic gradient placed on the backgrounds every time a scene is lit by candlelight, but the characters are all lit evenly, so they don't look like they're inhabiting the background. Every once in a while, a close-up will have more of a color gradient over the characters' faces, but it never ever matches with the lighting gradient behind them. It's a cheap-looking shortcut to lighting a scene that just kills a huge portion of the film even harder than the already boring dialogue does. Some visual aspects are okay most of the time, but it's hard for me to give it too much credit because it's also a very standard Studio Bones affair. Like, the kid has a lot of great facial expressions, but he's also kind of a dead ringer for Renton Thurston from Eureka 7. Every time a villain villain would suddenly show a super distinctive expression, it would feel like I was watching Full Metal Alchemist. This might be a weird thing to complain about, like it's not a problem that these expressions look like other Bones shows, it's just weird to watch a film that looks generic and boring for most of the time, and then suddenly busts out a really well done expression, but one that I specifically feel like I've seen in other Bones shows. The way the little kid was animated at times kind of felt like it was hearkening to the style of Miyazaki, but was far less expressive than any of that man's animation. There's multiple moments wherein the kid lifted something on the heavy side, but the lack of heft in his lifts just made me think about how many times I've watched a kid really struggle to lift something in a Ghibli film, and how memorable those images were by comparison. There is exceptional animation in this film, but it is all too short and too far between. If one scene represents the visual confusion of this film perfectly, it's when the characters are running on the beach, and there's one very brief but utterly gorgeous shot of the dog running on the water, bookended by awful looking silhouetted shots of the characters riding horseback behind a rolling CG foreground. Until the last part of the movie, every fight scene is woefully way too short, but I'll summarize each of them in brief anyways, as they are the main reason anyone would sit through this movie. The first action scene is animated by Hidetsugu Ito, and has the misfortune of being drawn over some of the shittiest backgrounds in the film, while under enough rainfall that it will never look good in streamed video. Ito is most impressive as an effects animator, with a large portfolio of explosions to his name, and we get a taste of that here with some badass shots of rain falling off of our villain's hat. However, most of the fighting is just a bit too fast and loose to have any real impact. Ito has seemingly improved dramatically as a fight animator in his future work, but this scene is at best to whet the appetite and make you hopeful that some cooler shit will come later on. The second fight is about 40 seconds long and is between our main warrior and some random fat guy with a whip. This one is animated by Takashi Tomioka, whose movement feels a lot heavier and contains some pretty difficult perspective shots and a bit more in the way of actual choreography. The biggest issue with this fight is that it ends almost immediately, after just barely scratching the surface of anything cool. The whip isn't exactly the most original weapon in the world, and all it's used for is to throw the main guy across the room, and then to be turned against the user in a kind of visually confusing way before he is defeated by a case jab to the neck. Now compare this to a similarly short but sweet action scene from Ninja Scroll, when Jubei kills a guy with a shooting chain weapon. The battle happens pretty similarly, but in this case the bad guy is using a claw attached to a chain, which is drawn with lots of mechanical detail, and we see the character morphing in and out of the shadows and doing creepy shit throughout the movie. When he finally dies, he gets killed out of a shadow, and it's super memorable, even though he lasted like 40 seconds in the actual fight. Compared to that, this scene from Stranger will pass right through you. Next up is our third fight, animated by Masahiro Sato, which is the most visually impressive yet, in spite of being literally just 15 seconds long. This is because almost the entire thing takes place at complicated and impressive looking perspective shots, and is punctuated by really heavy images, such as a blade cutting through the stranger's hat, revealing his hyper-focused eye, or the foreigner very nearly pushing him off a bridge at the end of this enormous semicircular motion. All of the lights glinting off of the swords in this scene are a nice touch as well, and it overall was the first part of the movie that made me think, whoa, that looked pretty cool, before about another half hour of boring dialogue scenes kicked into gear. After an eternity of teasing towards further action throughout the middle part of the film, finally the fourth fight scene arrives, animated by Hidetsugu Ito and Hirofumi Asada, and it is still only 13 seconds long. In spite of that, it's one of the best parts of the film so far, as it generously ramps up the gore to nearly horrific levels. It's right around here that a major tone shift occurs in this movie, and it suddenly begins to transform into an entirely different movie trapped inside of itself, but we'll talk about that momentarily. This scene is mostly noteworthy for a guy getting dragged around by his impaled head, limbs and heads flying everywhere, and a huge spurt of blood at the end, indicating that shit is getting real now, after no real blood had been shed since the very start of the movie. So around 70 minutes into this film, it suddenly invites in all of this horror iconography. We've got a monk character who commits suicide, panning shots of mutilated corpses, and this kid tied to a fucking cross at the top of a gigantic blood-soaked sacrificial pyre. This tone build keeps undercutting itself though by cutting to the main character, and in one completely tone-deaf moment plays motivational music over shots of totally evil-looking shit going on. Thankfully, the good part of the movie finally begins after this generic nobleman gets himself arrow-brained on the backdrop of a gigantic death tower, and a huge ridiculous anime battle scene begins. The stage is atmospheric as hell. We've got a bunch of buildings on fire while everything's covered in snow, and there's this huge bloody contraption looming in the background. At first, the fighting is styled very dryly, like a long and realistic siege battle, but then it rapidly expands in madness as all the superpowered Chinese warriors start tearing through hordes of samurai. At this point, the hyper-violence has kicked into high gear, and while the still dull color palette and still uneasy mixed media presentation prevents this from being a truly exceptional piece of art, it still starts to feel like a worthwhile and fun action movie. Basically, all of the animators from throughout the film return for one last hurrah in this scene, and everyone seems to be having a ball drawing all this violence. At one point, the tension is cut by a really shitty looking and at first seemingly unnecessary flashback, but then it punches you in the gut when we witness the lowest point in our main character's history, when he butchered a young boy and his sister at the behest of his former master, and we are left to stew in it for a bit, while the character also sits at his lowest and most useless point in the story. From this depth, then, our hero must fight his way all the way to the top of the tower, past all of the strongest Chinese supervillains, until he gets to the rival. Earlier in the film, the one design aspect of the main character which I had liked is that his sword was tied up by this charm that was meant to keep him from drawing it, and here it is burst from the sheath in glorious fashion. Then the sword is thrown spiraling like 80 feet through the air into a guy's body because this film is now a totally absurd cartoon. From this point forward, the fight scenes are way more inventively choreographed and badass, and all kinds of horrific imagery slips in. One established character is pretty fucked up by the rival and tries to make a heroic last stand, but then gets shot by some old bastard and dies quietly, never mentioned again. One of the Chinese warriors stumbles around begging for his sword, not realizing that it's lodged in his neck until he falls over dead. There's still some weird ass tonal confusion since the boy and his dog plot is still kinda going on in the background, but overall this section of the movie is pretty dope. Then we finally get into the last film within the film, which starts when the rival decides to kill the actual antagonist because all he really wants is the chance to fight the Wanderer. At this point, the tension and drama of the film is already over. The rest is just fan service, as we finally get to witness the dance of badasses that this entire film has been building up to. What follows from this is one of the most excellent fight scenes ever put to animation, full stop. Drawn by Yutaka Nakamura, this 2-minute scene is the entire reason that anyone has ever talked about this film. I've watched it so many times that it doesn't even have an impact on me anymore, but that's only a testament to how great I have thought it was over the years. It's amazingly choreographed, utilizing the setting and its snowfall to the fullest, constantly shifting into unique and highly technical perspectives, and with effects so sharp that you can hear the swords cutting through the air even without the sound on. Straight up, this scene made me a Sakuga nerd. Like years before I even knew Yutaka Nakamura's name, when he was just a scribble of kanji on the title of YouTube videos containing all of my favorite fight animations that I'd ever seen, this was what made me care about individual animators and their identities. If I had to summarize what's the deal with Sword of the Stranger, I would say that the film is nobody's vision. It feels like an animator showcase wrapped up in the pretense of a plot that can guide us to this one big ending set piece. The level of unnecessary background lore and filler conversations makes it feel like it was supposed to be a TV show that got cut down to a film, but not cut down nearly enough. The boy and his dog and traveling swordsman stuff is boring and lame, and the Chinese mysticism is somehow over-explained and underexplored at the same time. It's a boring-ass movie which would best be experienced as a Sakuga compilation, such a thing which would only show you around 10 of the 100 plus minutes in this film. Anyways, I've talked about this movie long enough. If you like this video, then consider supporting me on Patreon so I can make more like it and to get access to like hundreds of hours of bonus content. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.